Productive Pastor, episode 90, Creating Focus. What's going on, friends? Productive Pastor here with me, Chad Brooks, episode 90, Creating Focus. Something I've been thinking about a lot. We'll go into that in just a second. But it's great to have you back on the podcast. As always, this is the place where I talk about healthy ministry through strategic productivity. It's a new phrase. You might have heard me, seen me writing about that, talking about that a little bit. Actually, I have an episode about that coming up pretty soon. In a lot of ways, it was thinking through that was the impetus behind this episode about creating focus, because I came up with that phrase as I was trying to create focus a few months ago, thinking about just the whole ecosystem of Productive Pastor, the podcast, coaching I do, the resources, all of those sorts of things. It's a way to create focus. And so we're going to come back to that in a future episode, maybe next episode, maybe so. Maybe that's the time to do it. But we're going to talk about it right now, about what does it mean to create focus in ministry. You're going to do a little bit of theory land, talk about a lot of action land. Before I do that, I just want to ask you one question. Are you subscribed to the Productive Pastor emails? These come out every single week, and each month I kind of do a deeper dive on an aspect of ministry productivity. This whole month I've been talking about what does it mean to use a working notebook. The last one of those emails goes out today, the day you're hearing this episode, but you can find those. I talk about those online. I probably need to find a way to share those links bigger because over 400 people are getting those emails right now. But just make sure that you can cover that, especially this whole idea of a working notebook. Really applies to stuff we're talking about today. And that's just the tool that I choose to live in, absolutely. But let's not take too much time on the filler. Let's go straight into the conversation, this episode, about creating focus. Now, I think about that a lot right now. Focus has been a thing, in the last couple of months, even in my own prayer life, been thinking about what does it mean to stay focused? What does it mean to not just be indiscriminate and inconsequential with the things that I do in my ministry? What does it mean to be focused? And it's a very, very valuable thing. It might be the thing that I think about or I want the most right now. It's huge in this season, being bivocational, spread across. I've got 4 primary irons in the fire, and there's only so many hours in a week that you can do that healthy. And there's even a finite amount of hours to do it unhealthy. And so I've been trying to create a lot of focus and focusing in on focus. Michael Hyatt said this, that true productivity starts by being clear on what we truly want. That's clarity towards something specific. And in ministry, we have to be specific. We have to be focused, especially in this day and age of adaptive challenges, to where, it's no longer just using the same answers to the same old questions. That it really is about discerning, where is this place, where is this path that we should be going on? And so to be productive, to be about healthy productivity, we have to be able to understand what focus is and how to understand, and what does it mean to understand, to kind of go between the back and forth of finding focus, of staying focused, all the sorts of things. I've said focus enough right now. And so let's kind of just jump into this idea. Now, remember, one of the things I talk about a lot is about how there's a framework of ministry. There's reactive, there's responsive, but there's also proactive. And I think our ability to understand, to name, to declare focuses really is part of that paradigm. When we're reactive, we have no focus. We're literally focused on what drops right in front of us. To be responsive is a posture that we have to take in ministry because we can't just choose to not do things. This is a responsive job. But it's also growingly more of a proactive job where we have to understand the responsiveness inside of a paradigm of also moving things forward. So, like I said, we're going to get into the steps today, the things, talk about creating focus, and we're going to move into a little bit of theory land, but then also go into action land for the rest of the episode. So the theory land part of this is that I've discerned, my own understandings, my own struggles with focus. Because I say this often, I'm not the most productive pastor. If anything, I'm like the key misfit of the people who are trying to figure this out. But there's a thing called a sadia. Have you ever heard about it before? It's actually where, if you heard like the 7 deadly sins, there used to be 8. And sloth and acedia were lumped in together. You find a lot of monastics talking about acedia, but in short, Acedia, it's an ancient sin of boredom. In some ways, it's where procrastination also kind of lives. But in acedia, we are very ill-focused. That's probably not unfocused, but ill-focused. We might be too busy, and that's causing a lack of focus in our life. We might not be busy whatsoever at all, and that's causing us to fall into acedia. When we're not busy enough, where everything that we do is inconsequential. And this is one of the difficult rubs in ministry. And I found this out through a lot of coaching conversations and work I do with churches. But gone are the days of the country parson. There was a point in time in this job, and many of the people I read a lot of dead folks. I love older writings. In some of those situations, this was the day of the country parson. It was, hey, you make sure you preach well, make sure you do pastoral care, and you care for the souls of people. And that's what the job looks like. But those days don't exist anymore, especially in our post-COVID reality. We're going to come up with problems. There's going to be an expectation for things to be moving forward. And all of this I'm saying without taking the kind of primary foot forward I have many times, which is inside of ministry, not productivity conversations. But my primary foot forward is typically very evangelistic. It's very, let's go and reach people. That is consequential, and that takes strategy. That takes focus. That takes us learning what does it mean to lead our congregations from one place to another, because that is a conversation that the things that so many folks are asking for help for. I actually have some new workshops coming out that's going to run. I broke off something into three different sections. It's all about normal size congregational growth. And that's deeply strategic. And to be deeply strategic, to be inside of that land, means we have to be finding the time to be proactive in what we do. We have to be creating focus to say, I'm not too busy and I'm not bored and I'm working on things that really, really matter. And any sort of writing or thought about acedia helps us understand that. Because this is the thing, like I told y'all, this is actually in my prayer life right now. This is me realizing there are some things I need to be spending time and spending mental energy and relational energy on that really, really matter. And so my prayer lately, and sometimes has been help me stay focused, help me make sure I can discern, help me not just chase energy and fun conversations and learn what does it look like to make an impact in a way that I need to be making an impact right now vocationally. So that was just in theory land. Let's move into action land for the rest of the episode, and let's actually talk about what does it mean to create this focus. The first step is this. You have to declare something. You have to declare what you're going to be focused on. And you might have a bunch of things that you think you might need to be focused on. When I do yearly planning, we did the workshop earlier this year. Inside the Trello course, there's also a module on using Trello for yearly planning. And I love 3 questions. What do I need to be doing? What do I have to be doing? What do I want to be doing? And I know you, like me, can make massive lists under those 3 categories, but we have to begin filtering those out and discerning, what is the most appropriate, what's the most necessary and needed right now. And when we get to that point, really, there's 2 questions I love. This helps us understand and just clarify and iterate and break down those things into manageable chunks. But the questions are this: what will this change? And why does this matter? That gives us a great grid to understand a preferred future. And a lot of times, if I realize if I'm struggling with focus, what I've not distilled this thing down to a place to where it matters enough. And not just matters enough to other people, but matters enough to me, because sooner or later, no matter how exciting or how fascinating or whatever this thing's going to be, sometimes it's just going to be work. Sometimes it's going to be a task list, a job, some to-dos, all that sort of thing. And if the preferred future is not compelling enough to motivate even you, it might not be preferred enough. Now, we could chase a lot of leadership rabbits down that idea, but it's fact of the matter. If it's not compelling enough for you to break through and declare a priority and to build focus in, it might not be preferred enough. Just think about that. What that means is that we have to really get down into some of those essentials. What does this change? Why does this matter? And once you get answers to that, you might need to do it even yet again to clarify those things even more. What does this change? Why will this matter? Because sooner or later, you're going to have to realize you're going to have to stop doing the non-essential things, those inconsequential things, that big, huge list of inconsequential things you have in front of you that might be killing your focus. Sometimes it might just be a thing that you do just because you feel like you have to do it, or it might be a thing that you're doing because somebody before you did it, or it might be some cultural expectations that you have to begin putting the leadership energy around to say, listen, I know that this is this is an important thing to you, and this might be a very, very important thing for a season, but for right now, this is not what I need to be spending my time doing. And I don't think the tough part of that conversation is telling that to somebody in your congregation. Oftentimes, the tough part of that conversation is telling that to yourself. And so we have to stop doing the non-essential things. And if you don't know what those are, this is the perfect place for you to do a time audit, just to take a couple of weeks and just write down all the things you're doing, to think about your to-do list for the day, to write down the interruptions, to write down the times where you fall into the temptation of being reactive and in the moment. Do a time audit, write this stuff down. Don't try to change anything, but just gain a couple of weeks of clarity over the ways that you are spending your time. I've got a lot of resources. I'll pop a link in the show note to the time audit, the free sheet you can download. There's also episode 3 of the podcast is about time audits. There's tons of stuff that's there. If you can't find it and you have questions, just hit me up on the socials, on all the stuff, at Rev Chad Brooks. It's the same way everywhere. But find that stuff. That's the first thing, really the step is to declare what your focus is. The next step is to limit your focus. You cannot do every single thing you feel like has to be done, especially if we're going to be responsive, and even more especially if we're going to be proactive. And I've been talking about this, thinking through it personally, just kind of taking notes through it. It's this idea of what I call the priority pyramid, and this is what it looks like. You can do 1 to 2 big things at a time. That's it. Just 1 to 2 big things at a time. A bunch of big things will just lead you to being overwhelmed. So you have to think through that strategically across the whole course of a year, because sometimes there's big projects that might need to be done first, and then second, and then third. In the Trello course, we have a module on yearly planning, how I use Trello for that. That's going to be a tremendous resource for you if you're at this point and you say, Chad, I've got way too many big things that are going on. I need to figure out how to schedule, how to break them down into manageable chunks. I'll point you towards the Trello course. You can find a link to that in the show notes, revchadbrooks.com/PPP/090 in the show notes. But this is what the priority pyramid looks like for everybody in ministry, especially if you're in primary pastoral ministry, which I know most of the listeners here are. There's a priority pyramid. Number 1 and number 2 is at the bottom framework of that priority pyramid. It's your teaching ministry and your relationships. So that's pastoral care, discipleship, development, all that kind of stuff. Those things are non-negotiable. If you're bivocational or if you're working at this full-time, those 2 things have to have an absolute priority. And doing those 2 things will probably fill up, I would say, around 50% of your working time. So regardless if you're part-time or full-time, those 2 things need to have a 50% chunk of your schedule, because that's what's going to take to do those at the level you can do, non-negotiable. Now, after that, if you want to think about the proactive time, and you know your schedule better than I know your schedule, and there's a lot of conversations I've had about this, but really it's to think about this. What are the kind of your 3-month larger goals, projects? What's the 3-month focus? Then break that down into a 1-month focused. Break that down into a weekly focus, then break it down even more into a daily focus. Build those things out. The back half of season 1 of the podcast is all about understanding the year and those breakdowns of a year, a quarter, a month, a week, and a day into developing your own approach to personal productivity. Check out season 1 about that. Also, that's the back half of the Becoming Productive course, is working through all of those things, because when you've got a compelling understanding for a preferred future, and it's personally compelling and it's also congregationally compelling, then after that it's just about building out the plan and working the plan. But you have to limit your focus to what's the most appropriate at the time, but also what you have the ability to do at the time. And the third thing, and this is the last thing, is this: Schedule repeatable actions. I talk about tiny, huge tasks, tiny little things that have huge consequences. So many times what I know is the most compelling thing, the most energizing thing, the thing that will keep my focus, the most healthy over the long term is knowing I've gotten everything done today that I need to get done. And 9 times out of 10, if I check off that list, if I have a very good focused day, I'm not checking those things off at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Those things normally are getting checked off at 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning, because I don't have too many of those. I keep those limited to 3 to 5 priority things for the day. I have gotten them down usually into repeatable actions. We live in an adaptive world, not a technical world, but sooner or later you get to the point where you realize all I'm actually doing to stay focused on this larger thing is building in habits. That's what those tiny, huge are. Those tiny, huge tasks are just habits that that lead towards the preferred future. So think through those, put those things together. It might be things you do every day, it might be things you do every week, it might be things you just do every month. But when you can break those down into repeatable actions, it's going to be so much easier to maintain focus. And for people like me who, leading with influencing and strategic thinking strengths, I'm not an executor. The big motivator for me is knowing, hey, I had 4 things that absolutely had to get done today to lead to this preferred future. And I got them all hammered out really quick. Not because I worked really hard, not because I was uber productive and was all aboard the hustle bus all day long, but because I was able to break it down into things that are manageable for the day. That's the silver bullet that so many folks are looking for and they can't find is, you're doing the planning work to break this stuff down into manageable chunks. I talk with pastors all the time who have a lot of irons in the fire and they're context switching all over the place. And so many times when we work together to develop a better approach to ministry productivity for them, something that's very customized usually, it's doing the tough work to breaking the big things down into manageable chunks that allow you to be proactive inside of that. Because you're leading into the preferred future, and that means that you're reducing things down to what can be scheduled, what can be automated, in order for it to be normalized. And so many times in the normal-sized church, this does mean you have to go first. A lot of these first-level iterations are you figuring these things out well enough to clearly delegate it and hand it off to someone else. Sometimes the clarifying work is actually to realize this is valid. This is worth us, attaching to someone's job description or attaching to a volunteer's role. These sorts of things. But a lot of times the pastor has to go first in the normal sized church because you don't have these large staffs and you don't have, you might be an executor. I'm not an executor. You might be in my boat and you have an executor on staff, but they don't really enjoy the experimentation and the iteration side of this. I'm working with a leader right now, and that's one of the things that he is slowly realizing is he has to let the person on his staff that can execute really well be the executor, but he has to provide for them the clarity to not be asking questions about why and about how. And so this last part of focus to talk about today really is, break it down into scheduled, repeatable actions. Those 3 things are going to help you find and understand focus. And, you define what the focus is going to be. You limit your focus to be able to actually focus and apply your best self to it. And then getting into scheduled, repeatable actions. So thanks so much for sticking in. This episode of Productive Pastor, episode 90, is always an honor and a pleasure to have this time together with you. Thank you for listening. Do me a favor, share this podcast with your friends. Share the podcast with others in both Instagram and inside of iTunes and Spotify. When you share an episode directly from the episode link to somebody else, that does huge things for the show. And so share this episode with a friend. If you found it helpful, come hang out with us in the Productive Pastor community over on Facebook. It's over 1,000 ministry leaders that are doing this together, linked arms in arms to working towards this. So thanks so much for being part of this, and I will be back with you in the next episode.